Do you enter a primal state and begin frothing at the mouth as soon as a straight-edge man on stage barks like a dog over a fat riff? Do you have bright dyed hair and actively wear perhaps some of the most heinous clothing in subculture history? Are you an active TikTok user who regularly scrolls through videos including thirst trap band edits, fat bold men recommending vinyl records, and incredibly violent concert footage? Does this algorithm make you feel like the main character? Do you feel important in your pathetic asinine life? Well, although each of these questions relate to a very different type of person, if you said yes to any of them, you may enjoy one of the many incarnations of the overarching genre of metalcore. But what is metalcore? Well, strap in, this is going to be a long one. Based on the name alone, you'd assume that metalcore just consists of elements from both the genres of hardcore and metal, you know, metalcore. And for the most part, that is the case. Although much like any genre of music that has core at the end of its name, metalcore has strayed far away from the sound of the original bands who received the label term, making it very difficult to define what metalcore actually is. Due to the way in which the genre has evolved, the definition will change depending on who you ask. So in order to actually explain what metalcore sounds like whilst removing all of my personal bias, I will present to the class 4 individuals, with each of these people representing a particular era of the genre, and of course massively oversimplifying the absolute mess that is metalcore. First, let's go back to 1995 and say hello to Braden. Braden represents the first era of metalcore and specifically enjoys wearing Ringworm, Integrity and Converge t-shirts. Braden loves spitting in the face of any long-haired metalhead he may see within the pit, although behind closed doors he is secretly a big fan of Pantera and Metallica, but will never admit that at a show. This has led him to the blossoming genre of metalcore. Braden explains the genre to be a style that utilizes the attitude and aggression of hardcore, although instead of playing the same 3 riffs over and over again whilst encouraging audience members to do their best up Conor McGregor impression in the audience, he prefers a little bit extra added to the stew. This comes in the form of, God forbid, slightly complicated elements, taking inspiration from contemporary heavy metal as well as bands from the past like Slayer, specifically through the breakdown segment Slayer spearheaded in the song Raining Blood. The vocals are coarse and harsh like a bullfrog being tortured within a tiny torture chamber designed exclusively for frogs, and the tones are harsh and distorted, layering more complicated riffs and solos over a traditional hardcore structure that utilizes both the hardcore style of drumming with a tasty insertion of a few blast beats along the way. Despite Braden's love for the new genre of metalcore, he hates any upcoming band that is using melodic elements and wants the genre to stay aggressive. Little did he know this would be the fate of the entire genre moving forwards. This is Braden's description of metalcore, which sounds pretty fitting for a genre that is named, you know, metalcore. So let's move forward 10 years and ask Yasmin. Yasmin is a scene queen. She has bright pink hair and you would most commonly find her scouring MySpace for any band that looks like this on her Hello Kitty laptop. Her definition of metalcore is very different from Braden. She doesn't know who Black Flag is and just assumes integrity is a trait she lacks due to the heinous outfits she commonly wears to shows. For Yasmin, metalcore is massive, huge shows featuring bands playing fat breakdowns with melodic pop-punk singing. The production is clean, the lyricism is overly edgy, lacking any real subject matter, and at times the music includes instrumentation that would rarely be seen in metal, such as synth lines and 2000s club music within the breakdowns. Yasmin will occasionally see a very aging Braden at Killswitch Engage shows, although they don't seem to get along. Yasmin hates that Braden constantly calls modern metalcore shit, and Braden hates that Yasmin won't sleep with him despite the fact that Yasmin is borderline underage. Alright, this is starting to sound like a weird alternative fanfiction and I do not want to do this anymore. So let's move on to some characters within the modern day. This is Emily. Emily is a they them and discovered all of her music from TikTok. She has an algorithm full of smut and scream mask thirst traps. She consistently reads fanfiction about her favourite bands and isn't really sure what metalcore is at all. She just assumes it to be any form of alternative metal that utilise elements that aren't particularly heavy. This has led her to many Sleep Token and Fallen in Reverse shows, although she has recently gotten into Knocked Loose because of her girlfriend. I don't know what name, like what the f do I do for the names? Shit, Anna? Okay, Anna. Anna got into music through TikTok and discovered each generation of metalcore individually. She loves Converge, Poison the Well, Killswitch Engage, and personally believes the genre should always have hardcore elements, and consistently listens to bands such as Weapon X and Loathe in the modern day. For her, metalcore is a combination of hardcore ethos, tempo switches, distorted riffs, and a lyrical style that is simple to the point point and reflects ongoing issues within the world. Although she has been to Sleep Token shows with her girlfriend, she doesn't consider them metalcore, utilizing the term Octane core instead, and exclusively utilizing metalcore to describe the bands that more so reflect the original style of the genre. So out of all of these people, who is correct? Well, due to the nature of metalcore, each of these individuals is technically correct, which may make absolutely zero sense, although fret not, young one. Let's dive into the actual history of the genre so we can truly understand everything that metalcore is. It's difficult to actually define where metalcore came from, primarily due to the fact that the genre ejaculated into so many different directions that the conventions and style differ depending on who you ask. Actually, scratch that. If you ask a hardcore elitist, you can guarantee every single time that stinky motherfucker will immediately call you wrong and a poser regardless of what you say. If we take metalcore literally, it's a combination of metal and hardcore metalcore. So let's explore artists that combined those two genres early on in metalcore's development. But very quickly, before we look into that, we have to visit an essential element of modern day metalcore, a technique that perhaps helped explode many bands into popularity and inserted hardcore in the minds of Zoomers, and that's not even mentioning the amount of heinous injuries it has likely caused. I am of course talking about the breakdown. If we look at the breakdown in terms of music as a whole, it has existed for decades, probably this dude, I don't know, but these musical styles don't utilize chuggy palm muted riffs alongside slow kick heavy drums, so literally none of us give a single fuck. The breakdown first saw usage within thrash metal, specifically through the band Slayer, who utilized single note chugging guitar alongside an emphasis on percussion to create what is considered by many to be the first breakdown on the song Raining Blood. Although that is of course a metal song, no core to be seen, so let's throw it in the trash and swiftly move on. Luckily, the earliest of the metalcore bands took note of this disgusting musical element and started utilizing it within their hardcore adjacent music. We can obviously look towards Agnostic Front, Suicidal Tendencies and Cro-Mags when exploring bands specifically inspired by Slayer's thrash metal style, but that would be f***ing crossover thrash. Obviously every genre has pioneers and proto bands who utilized aspects of the style without actually fitting into the particular genre, so let's quickly mention Bad Brains and Black Flag, who started inserting a few heavier metal elements into their music. The latter would actually slow down the typical blistering hardcore punk formula with an emphasis on slow chuggy riffs, and although in terms of pure etymology the B-side of My War by Black Flag should be considered metalcore, it more so reflects the sound of later sludge metal, so once again in the goddamn trash. In terms of actual metalcore bands that inspired metalcore, it's a toss-up between two 90s Cleveland hardcore acts, Integrity and Ringworm, which nowadays would more so be considered metallic hardcore, but we will get to that later. If you are unfortunate enough to ever find yourself within the dystopian comment section that is situated under any form of hardcore or metalcore social media post, Integrity is the artist that is pointed to most often as starting the genre. Integrity combined a few key elements: industrial influence, a fascination with cults, and an absolute hatred for glam metal, combining these traits to create a sound that was able to fit into the hardcore scene and sound, whilst utilizing various elements of metal that differentiated Integrity from contemporaries. Integrity was the brainchild of Dwid Helion, who as a teen became fascinated with creating fake bands. These bands included fake logos, fake merch, fake promo material, and of course, an entirely fabricated backstory. One of these bands would be Integrity, the violent straight edge act who would physically assault anyone who may be drinking at shows. The band remained a joke for the following years until one of Helion's early bands would break up, resulting in the official formation of Integrity. 1991 would see the release of the band's debut album, Those Who Fear Tomorrow, which was immediately panned by critics within the hardcore scene. Not because it sounded bad, no, not at all, because it was different. It didn't fit into the typical hardcore formula that was popular at the time. It actually introduced new forward-thinking elements into the sound, which obviously pissed off everyone who looked like this. Oh, how times have changed. It utilized the crunchy style of distortion, often laid over chugging, and a healthy offering of metal-like solos. The vocals also reflected heavy metal, kind of sounding like a toad being violently throttled by an incredibly small, although jacked gnome. Lyrically, themes were also darker, reflecting their obsession with religion and the occult. Charles Manson prominently reared his groovy head within the lyricism, with Helion actually claiming to have a personal relationship with Manson, which makes perfect sense considering Manson would actually endorse the album from prison. So this all sounds awfully metal. What about the the core? Well, it still stuck to the formula of hardcore structurally and used a lot of the sound whilst being situated slap bang within the scene. It was definitely still hardcore, just a little bit metallic hardcore perhaps. Alright, so what about Ringworm? Well, Ringworm are a little bit different, especially in terms of where they situated themselves within hardcore and metal scenes. This can be highlighted by a 2019 interview from the frontman Human Furnace, who claimed their music to be primarily thrash metal inspired. Although the band regularly played hardcore shows, they claimed the audience would just stand around and wait for a particularly heavy riff so they could immediately crowd kill and run around in circles as they do. This led the band to highlight their preference for metalhead gigs, as the audience members more so responded to their style of playing, you know, greasy headbanging, that kind of shit. Their debut, The Promise, would release in 1993, taking what Integrity had already developed previously and adding perhaps more metal elements into the stew. It goes so far into the metal direction that many individuals, including the band themselves, consider Ringworm to be more so a metal project, although the prominence of breakdowns, drumming, vocal style, and of course stage presence clearly align the band with hardcore. Much like any and every genre, especially ones that were spit out of the herpes-ridden mouth of hardcore, there are so many bands we can mention who utilize aspects of what metalcore would become, although neatly insert themselves into other genres. Rorschach utilized the more dissonant elements of metal within their hardcore sound, although slowly but surely transitioned into slower paced sludge, even occasionally utilizing a vocal style that would typically be considered early screamo. Starkweather were also an early example that remained unique in the fact that they were well and truly considered to be a metal band that utilized hardcore elements as opposed to vice versa, and also made a nice little dent onto the future mathcore sound. I'll tell you what, instead of you listening to me list out musical techniques and elements that contributed to this style, I want you to picture this instead. You know, when it's late at night, you're famished and you have no real food in the house, just ingredients, and you're forced to schizophrenically throw shit together to appease your hunger. Starkweather reflects these events, although only when the outcome is absolutely delicious and scoffed down within minutes. Alright, so moving on. Motherfucking Earth Crisis, a band that can be considered equally as influential to metalcore as they can be to the entirety of hardcore as a subculture and movement. This is mainly through their social and political stances. Based on the name alone, it's easy to infer the fact that the band were incredibly environmental, influencing not only animal rights, veganism, and a climate focus within hardcore, but straight edge culture as a whole. Alongside Ian MacKaye himself, Earth Crisis are perhaps the band to thank when you have to wait a ridiculously long time for artisan coffee at hardcore festivals. They encouraged direct action towards the issues they felt were important to address. It wasn't enough to avoid drugs and alcohol, you had to actively fight against the degradation of the natural world, with violence only being necessary as a final resort. Let's shift our focus to the sound and style of Earth Crisis's actual music. Although Earth Crisis ideologically took more influence from the DC scene, in terms of sound they were New York all the way. Think Cro-Mags and Agnostic Front, although they differed in the fact that they decided to push forwards the heaviness and technicality within their style. We can take a bumpy plane journey all the way back to the United Kingdom, as we always do when looking at bands that influenced Earth Crisis, specifically with Napalm Death, who although are considered grindcore pioneers, heavily utilized aspects of death metal and would in turn neatly fit itself into the Earth Crisis vegan stew. Even more classic metal bands like Metallica, Sepultura, Slayer and Iron Maiden would inspire Earth Crisis, which is ironic considering how polar opposites they are to Earth Crisis in terms of ideology. And it says here, cut to clip of Lars yamming down on meat or some shit like that, which I don't think I can find, so just look at this. Their second EP would inspire various other bands within the scene. This was achieved through harsh lyricism, chugging riffs, and a tasteful introduction of metal into hardcore, which again nowadays would be considered metalcore, but again we'll get to that. Earth Crisis had well and truly made a dent onto the scene, inspiring many bands to follow suit in that particular sound. The thing is with metalcore, however, it's incredibly difficult to attribute influence to just one band. It's as if the emergence of the 90s kicked a metallic boot up the jacksie of the hardcore scene, with countless bands forming in separate locations and slowly but surely introducing metal elements into the music to varying levels of schizophrenia, might I add, with many examples sounding like completely different heavy genres. Perhaps the most prominent of this more complex and schizo variety of metalcore would be Converge, who would form out of Salem, Massachusetts in 1990, 2 years after the formation of Integrity and a year before the debut album that is said to have started this whole metalcore fiasco. The band would form when lead singer Jacob Banham was only 14 years old, with the early band members being sparked on by a collective passion of early metal music. Alongside more hardcore affiliated bands like
Fugazi and Mars Icon,
they became fascinated by the concept of creating art. They could essentially make something out of nothing, and as that something began to resemble the music they were personally passionate about, nothing could stop Converge. Well, apart from early on their guitarist at the time couldn't really play scales. Luckily, a kid named Kurt Ballou could play scales and was brought on as the guitarist, with Kurt going on to change Converge and perhaps the entirety of hardcore for the better in the decades following this decision. Converge would spend the following years transitioning from an independent band self-producing cassettes to one of the most exciting and experimental acts within hardcore. So how exactly did this transition occur? Well, Converge had always been interested in the idea of combining metal and hardcore, and as they attracted new members, their influence as a collective began to diversify. They appreciated the overly technical and clean aspects of metal, but decided to reject it in terms of their specific sound, instead preferring overwhelming noise and distortion. Despite the fact the band were incredibly young throughout the 90s, even at times having to break bandmates out of school to record EPs, they were mature in the way they utilized their influences. They took elements from countless different subgenres and utilized them on songs and projects that were slowly but surely morphing into a sound that was exclusive to Converge. They were improving, and something groundbreaking was inevitable, and that ground would officially break in 2001 with the release of perhaps the greatest metalcore album and my personal favourite album of all time. But that album would release in 2001. We have accidentally jumped a few years ahead, and with doing that ignored a few other prominent figures, so let's backtrack a little bit and explore a band that sound and legacy perhaps doesn't reflect the genre-defining work of Converge, but in terms of pure adoration from hardcore and metalcore kids, nothing really beats Master Killer by Marauder. Marauder would also form in 1990, although it would take them 6 years to release their debut album Master Killer. It seems the band's time working on various demos throughout that period paid off, as upon release Master Killer truly cemented the metallic sound within New York hardcore. They took the typical sound and image of Beatdown that was incredibly popular within that location at the time and introduced metallic elements that differed from Converge in terms of technicality, but made up for it in what I see as an entirely different brand of aggression. The riffs are heavy, crunchy and power chord heavy, utilizing a groove that was seen by the likes of Pantera in the past. This Pantera influence rings true when exploring the vocals on the album, utilizing an over-the-top lyrical style which reflects aspects of the theatrical metal of the time, but still well and truly sits within the violent aggression that was seen in Beatdown. A similar description can be laid upon Hatebreed, although Hatebreed were able to do it to far more resounding mainstream success. In the past, hardcore bands that aligned themselves with the metal sound typically stayed within the hardcore scene and remained popular within that closed-off crowd. Hatebreed differed in the fact that they essentially became the hardcore band tailor-made for the metal fanbase, which did a lot for the growth of the style. Suddenly there was a band that visually relayed many of the aspects of New York Beatdown whilst playing a style that was appreciated and encouraged by metal listeners. It only prepped the combination of metal and core for a mainstream audience. Little did anyone know at the time, however, is that the mainstreamification of metalcore was going to sound very, very different to the various Beatdown inspired bands coming out of New York. Alright, I'll stop edging you and we can begin to explore how metalcore slowly morphed into a more melodic genre. As the 90s began to come to a close, the style of Marauder and Hatebreed was still very prominent within the scene, although there were a few examples of bands combining hardcore and metal that, instead of focusing on pure aggression, decided to push towards a more melodic direction, which would eventually be the fate of the entire genre as it pushed into the mainstream in the turn of the millennium. The first band to do this would be the pioneering metalcore band Poison the Well, a band that perhaps made much of the genre within the modern day possible through their forward-thinking melodic approach to the Rogue combination. This would be cemented with the release of their debut album, The Opposite of December, A Season Separation, which upon first listen makes it very obvious why it's considered such a groundbreaking project for the genre. Pretty much every element heard on the album has been subsequently used by countless metalcore bands throughout the decades since. One key element that heavily inspired the commercial 2000s metalcore sound was its melodic features. Instead of the vocalist resembling the common toad, he utilized clean melodic vocal lines, and although Hatebreed had been able to bring the combination of styles into the mainstream in a way that was very different to Poison the Well, nothing would compare to the insane popularity bands inspired by this project were able to receive in the 2000s. Poison the Well would continue to release various projects within the style, eventually becoming a mainstay within the genre and experiencing mainstream attention a few years later. Despite all of this yapping about melodic elements and clean vocal lines, the album that would first catapult the style into the hearts of heavy music fans around the world would be far from melodic in terms of both instrumentation and vocal style. An album so crushing and forward thinking, it remains a key topic within the heavy discussion to this very day. Yes, we are finally returning to Converge, with perhaps the greatest metalcore album of all time, Jane Doe. Jane Doe would be released upon the unsuspecting ears of hardcore kids in 2001, featuring an album cover that is perhaps as iconic as the music itself. A portrait of a woman staring through your soul, designed by the lead singer Jacob Bannon himself. It is the perfect representation of the sound on the album, upsetting, unrelenting, but for some strange reason comfortable in a way that's incredibly uncomfortable, whatever the that means. The music follows the formula of the cover, presenting unrelenting distortion layered upon math rock style guitar riffs, all on top of driving although creative blast beat heavy drums, which aren't complete without Jacob Bannon's distinct screech style of vocals. It creates a sound that perfectly encapsulates the subject matter of a relationship slowly dissolving. The album features so many highs and lows, but not in terms of quality, in terms of the emotional state it consistently throws in your direction. Just as you've been able to recover from the unrelenting speed and power of Concubine, you are then harassed by various other unrelenting tracks before you can get a glimmer of rest at the beginning of Hell to Pay. Jane Doe's an album that spans metalcore itself. It's truly a marvel of not only distorted heavy music but songwriting and production. Although looking back at the album it's easier to attribute much of its sound to mathcore and the more technical heavy genres in the modern day, it still made a sizable dent onto metalcore through its technicality and songwriting, with Converge continuing to put out quality music to this day. So if you're aware of the common representation of metalcore both visually and musically, you must in turn be expecting some sort of big shift in the early 2000s. Metalcore in the 90s still very much had a typical hardcore aesthetic, either tough guys in bandanas or just NPC motherfuckers in jeans and t-shirts. So how did it morph into an over-the-top theatrical genre that more visually reflected these motherfuckers than this motherfucker? Well, it's all thanks to one little band out of Orange County, a band that not only influenced metalcore, but the visual style of emo and scene culture for decades to come. This band would be 18 Visions, who contrasted the hyper-masculine visual presentation of metalcore by being the exact opposite of hyper-masculine. Their hair was wacky, they utilised eyeliner with skin-tight clothes. They were essentially an overly edgy version of hair metal, which obviously received pushback from the metalcore community, who would in turn label them Fashioncore. Despite the original derogatory label, their influence in terms of the visual style dwarfs any other artist within the early scene, allowing for the development of emo and essentially creating scene culture, two subcultures that would link themselves to metalcore in the decades to come. This developed a sort of fashioncore scene within Orange County, with bands like Avenged Sevenfold following suit, eventually to huge overarching success and a dominance over the entirety of metal. Despite the visual presentation, 18 Visions were still pretty harsh musically. There was another band within the death metal scene, however, taking things into a melodic direction and potentially shifting the course of metalcore for decades to come. This band would be At the Gates, who would inspire the likes of Shadow's Fall. Melody became key to the genre. It slowly defined the sound of other bands. No longer was it subject to a few key players in the late 90s, and no band would encapsulate this wave more than Killswitch Engage, which takes us immediately away from the harsh sound of the past and towards melodic metalcore. Whilst metalcore was slowly but surely simmering in the underground, mainstream metal was focused on one thing and one thing only, and that was motherfucking nu metal. The visually powerful, hip-hop heavy brand of alternative metal had not only held a chokehold over the mainstream for a good few years, but also thanks to some assistance from grunge beforehand, had allowed for the more heavy and edgy side of music to receive mainstream attention, and perhaps primed metalcore for its mainstream emergence, which would be spearheaded by a little band named Killswitch Engage. Killswitch Engage would form in 1999, meaning they were present for the tail end of nu metal, although were entirely confused by that genre's popularity. They noticed a lack of technicality and blast beats, with this being replaced by over-the-top theatrics and weird mouth noises. Their sensibility towards music would be equally inspired by their reaction to hardcore as their reaction to nu metal, with the years prior to Killswitch being utilised on various other hardcore bands such as Overcast, who found themselves tired of what they saw as a stagnant hardcore scene. They added metal elements, but it wasn't enough. They needed to keep pushing the envelope, resulting in the formation of Killswitch Engage. The release of Self-Titled in 2000 would cement this new sound. It was a messy balance of many things: melodic and harsh vocals, simple riffage and technicality, hardcore style drums and blast beats. It definitely made a dent, and although it remained within the underground, it was able to catch the attention of labels, priming Killswitch Engage for monumental mainstream emergence. The signing to Roadrunner was instrumental to the band's early success. The industry were noticing the death of nu metal at the time, with much of the band's early marketing reflecting this idea, eventually culminating in the release of Alive or Just Breathing in 2002, 2002, MTV were obsessed, fans were obsessed. It truly marked not only a new sound for metalcore, neatly picking various elements from the past, but also a new direction for mainstream metal entirely, influencing countless bands to come, and of course, cementing metalcore as a mainstream genre, that in terms of sound was a far cry from the metallic hardcore of the past. Killswitch engaged alongside contemporaries such as Avenged Sevenfold, As I Lay Dying, and Bullet for My Valentine, had truly shot the style of metalcore into the mainstream, although it vastly differed from what had come beforehand. The breakdowns were heavier and more prominent, it was far bigger than before, removing much of the intimate hardcore environment, and most importantly, it was more approachable to a diverse audience, leaving nu metal in the dust entirely and cementing the metallic hardcore stylings of the past as a genre fully stuck in the underground. Metalcore was here to stay, but it was very different. There was just one thing on the horizon, something that none of us could see coming, a time in history where the mainstreamification of alternative subcultures and sounds was expanding at such a rapid rate. A rate so rapid it still has knock-on effects to this day, mainly through Brad, aged 27, asking an obvious emo to step on his balls before calling her a goth mummy. I am indeed discussing the rise of scene and emo culture that primarily stemmed from websites like MySpace and stores such as Hot Topic. MySpace had become one of the most prominent ways to market music online. Soulja Boy was able to do it, so why not literally every metalcore band on the planet? MySpace was also lumped in with a particular visual style, a style inspired by the Antioch Arrows and 18 Visions of the past, although more so resembling an over-the-top parody of these two styles than anything actually cool. I'm joking. Any scene queen in the modern day, you look great, okay? This style further linked itself with metalcore. If you looked like this and made a song that had a melodic line catchy enough, there was a huge market and audience for that music. Through MySpace, it catapulted various bands to success, and through that came another period of mass diversification for the genre. Metalcore opened borders, if you will. This period of metalcore's history was similar to its first emergence in the fact that various bands were taking the sound into different directions, although massively differed in terms of the amount of subgenres that were being spat out, and how over the top some of them had become. Deathcore rose to prominence around this time, which utilized more death metal style riffs and blast beats through bands like Suicide Silence and Whitechapel. This was then followed by the stain that was electronicore, which followed a typical metalcore formula structurally, although for some reason decided to add synth lines and 2000s club music into the breakdowns. The visual style of electronicore followed the absurdity of its sound and split metalcore fans into two separate groups. On one side there were the Scene Kids, a group of colourful little misfits who discovered metalcore through MySpace and were infatuated with the sound of bands like Attack Attack and Enter Shikari, and then the metalcore purists, who were around for the emergence of Converge and Poison the Well, and began to see metalcore's slow shift into an oversaturated, over-the-top mess, a mess that was beginning to resemble the dying days of nu metal. The online perception of metalcore began to dampen somewhat. For core fans, the genre was becoming so oversaturated, with bands focusing on various sounds and styles, it felt as if the identity was being lost, and for standard metal fans, they were just being presented with a genre full of people who acted and at times sounded incredibly goofy. The core elements had been lost, it was just goofy, overly theatrical internet metal with breakdowns. Despite this seeming like a problem with the genre itself, I don't believe that's entirely the case. There were plenty of quality metalcore coming out of that era. It was simply an oversaturation problem. Metalcore was being played at music festivals, punk festivals, pretty much any festival that included rock music. It was impossible to escape whether you were scouring the internet for new music or tuning into countercultural music television shows. It was overpowering, and much like any alt genre from the past that experiences this kind of mainstream attention, the bubble was bound to pop, which happened now. This didn't kill the genre, however, far from it. It just picked out a few outliers to remain in the spotlight and shoved the rest into the deep pockets of the underground, which actually brings us to one of the many genre dilemmas of metalcore. As the genre began seeing usage to define more melodic bands in the 2000s, the bands that more so aligned themselves with Marauder and Integrity were forced to slap a new label on the style that stuck to its hardcore sensibilities, receiving the term, in some cases, metallic hardcore, a term that actually saw usage way back when these bands first emerged. Metallic hardcore became a mainstay and at times in the modern days just used interchangeably with the term metalcore, which only makes this entire thing more confusing and irritating to actually explore without pissing at least a few people off. Luckily, that is my goal and not something I'm particularly trying to avoid. We now find ourselves in the late 2010s, a time period where outside of a few prominent examples, metalcore's brief mainstream explosion had essentially died. That does not mean the genre itself died, however, far from it. If anything, this time period injected more health into the genre than any period previously. This had a lot to do with the internet and just an overall shift in culture that was beginning to occur around this time. As once forgotten genres like Midwest emo and shoegaze were bubbling in the underground thanks to online discussion and a youth that was able to explore so much more of the past, so was metalcore. Although it was developing in a way that seemed far more natural and forward-thinking than a band with a shit haircut throwing a synth track over the already established formula. Another shift in the specifically metal culture also attributed to the underground growth of metalcore, the acceptance of metal within hardcore scenes. During the 90s there was a bitter, although incredibly cringe feud between hardcore and metal. It even got to the point where people got the shit beaten out of them for having long hair at hardcore shows. This was beginning to simmer down. Hardcore returned to being a community accepting of everyone, regardless of personal style, well, unless you're like a racist. We don't particularly need to say that, do we? Which allowed metalcore to develop in a more natural and organic manner. This gave birth to Code Orange, Vane, Harm's Way, God's Hate, Knocked Loose, Loathe, too many to list off in one video. Although there are a few prominent bands within that list that need to be explored further, let's start with Code Orange, the band that originally labelled themselves Code Orange Kids and began their career playing traditional hardcore music, began to branch out into incredibly inventive and satisfying metalcore, utilising various electronic and industrial influences. They essentially became the Knocked Loose before Knocked Loose, bringing a hard-hitting and destructive sound to a more mainstream metal audience, whilst shining a spotlight onto the hardcore community as a whole. We then have Loathe, who alongside more mainstream bands like Spiritbox, continued to push forwards the stew into the more shoegaze direction, which developed a new spin on the melodic side of metalcore, whilst still staying true to the original stylings of the genre. It seems the original style and subculture of metalcore is seeing a resurgence that may even dwarf the 2000s in terms of the amount of releases, and of course relation to the actual roots of the genre. The band that is perhaps spearheading this movement is of course Knocked Loose, an unrelenting metalcore band that fully align themselves with hardcore sensibilities and history, whilst still pushing the sound to countless new listeners through Grammy nominations and Jimmy Kimmel appearances. So why is the original style and ethos of metalcore seeing such a resurgence in the modern day? I must sound like a broken record at this point, but it is just kind of social media and TikTok, but not in the same way as nu metal, where the visual aspects of the genre skyrocketed its appeal. It's all because of that little technique I described right at the beginning of the video, the breakdown. If any musical technique could be used as a short form snippet intended for fast-paced music marketing, it's the goddamn breakdown. Not only does the sound instantaneously present the personality and aggression of the band, but the concert's behaviour that often coincides with the breakdown is perfect bite-sized hardcore brain rot, and has brought the sound and scene to so many people, which obviously comes with various positives and a healthy serving of negatives. Of course, the sound is also good. I notice this in videos that I make. I say that there's a reason for a genre blowing up, and then people are like, no, you're wrong because it just sounds good. I know it sounds good. Fuck me if I just said this is popular because it sounds good. Why would I be here and why would you be watching this shit? Sorry. That wasn't in the script. I just... So wait. If the resurgence of metalcore in the modern day more so reflects integrity than it does Killswitch, why the fuck is this considered metalcore? How can Weapon X and fucking Sleep Token be in the same stratosphere musically? Well, it brings us to one of the big issues with the usage of genres, especially with styles of music that have the potential to evolve in so many different ways. Just as soon as the term metalcore began seeing usage, bands were already taking it in a melodic direction. This melodic direction just so happened to reach a mainstream audience, which attached the term metalcore to that specific style. This then creates a divide when we reach a period in culture where music is as accessible as it is today. Labels and bigwigs can no longer really decide what a piece of music is. We decide. A kid can get into Ringworm as easily as they can get into Attack Attack, which are both labelled as metalcore, which results in the genre meaning different things to different people. For many, including myself, metalcore is hardcore with metal elements, but throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, that just simply was not the case. Do we have to remove the label from all of that music, or is it just something we have to accept when genres are used to describe music that can and will evolve so rapidly? Do we need to create another sub-genre whenever a band decides to add a new guitar pedal to the pedal board? Or should we just reject when record labels and journalists decide to force specific labels onto specific scenes just for the purpose of marketing? This is not for me to decide really, and although this does sound almost identical to an outro, we still do have one scene to briefly explore, Octanecore. Whilst there is one section of metalcore that is sweating and stage invading hardcore shows in the modern day, There is another section selling out huge stadiums, playing glossy, overproduced pop music, whilst putting on overly theatrical stage acts. This is known as Octanecore, and is primarily played by bands such as Sleep Token and Spiritbox. So is Octanecore metalcore? Based on my understanding and appreciation of the genre, no, not at all, but who am I to decide? It easily dwarfs any other section of metalcore in terms of popularity, and is used to describe a sound that can mean literally anything. Metalcore differs from other genres that experience confusion in terms of genre definition, such as screamo or like breakcore, in the fact that people still can't seem to decide what the definition to stick to is. Is metalcore hardcore? I think so, but does this dude think so? Probably not. So who am I to call him wrong, other than the fact that I could easily shove his head down a toilet? Metalcore was an example of a genre with so much potential from the get-go. Metal and hardcore, what is there not to like about that combination? There's so many possibilities and avenues to explore in terms of these two titans of heavy music, but that is the exact issue. There are so many elements from both genres to pick from when deciding on a sound, which in turn meant the genre spat into so many different directions. The label essentially meant nothing and continues to mean nothing in the modern day. But hey, more music, more fun I suppose. The nerds can sit 60 feet away from their masked metalcore, whilst epileptic light shows blind them from actually seeing the fucking Veptools sing on stage, whilst us cool kids can get a busted lip listening to a straight edge motherfucker rant on stage like a whiny teenager. Everybody wins, everybody wins. And do you know who else wins? And it's not the sponsor of this video, it's you right now. Considering the fact that metalcore's original stylings has seen such an insane emergence in the modern day, I think it's only right to shout out a few bands, although you have heard me yap for far too long in this video. So let me transition you over to the resident metalcore expert, Mr. Metalcore himself, James EXE.
Right, so you want to know about some new and bloody good metalcore, and I am here to talk to you about your Bad Omens and your Sleep Tokens. I'm here to tell you about that good shit. The kind of shit that makes you want to spin kick your nan. And what better place to start than my own country, God's country, good old Blighty. Most of these bands are from up north, which is a shame. What are you gonna do? We can't all be perfect. Anyway, first up, we've got Killing Me Softly. These guys are probably one of the best examples of this new wave of UK bands dragging metalcore back into the dirt. And I mean that complimentary. Their stuff is raw and pissed off that they're not here to write arena bangers, but to crowd kill you into another decade. Same with Long Goodbye. Their music is like a violent outburst in your ears. The vocals are desperate cries enveloped in between breakdowns. Take early counterparts mixed with the stylings of Converge. That's Long Goodbye. And we can't forget Croquill. These guys have only just spawned in, but they have already dropped one of the most exciting EPs of the last decade. It sounds like if Vane, Converge and Unbroken Wings had a baby from Leeds. Now let's move across the pond to sunny Florida, because yeah, they have Disney World, but they also have Contention. These guys are the perfect modern embodiment of straight edge metallic hardcore. It's an onslaught of hard riffs and stompy drums, with Cosmo's vocals sound like they're recorded mid-breakdown, and I ain't talking about the musical kind. And finally, we have A November Morning. Ever heard of them? Probably not, as they only have like 4 songs. See, I told you we were going into the freshest shit. What can I say about these guys other than it's metalcore, but more moody? They take a lot of influence from doom metal as well as metallic hardcore. If you like 6-minute songs, riffs, and riding on horseback into battle, this band is for you. But if you're sat there thinking, now how the hell am I going to find more bands that sound like this when this video ends? Then look no further, my friends, than to the Coming Strife Records. These guys are a UK label that has been championing that metallic hardcore sound we all love. In fact, the majority of the bands that I just mentioned are on this label. You want good metalcore? Keep up to date with the Coming Strife.